Laughter is the loudest sound on a shooting range, and I have learned to distrust it. I learned that on the day Lord Castellan Pyrrhal, the finest sportsman in the Kingdom of Eldermoor, or so every herald in 3 counties swore, threw back his head and laughed at a king's guard who had not yet fired a single shot. We were standing on the great green at Harrogate. The long lane of the contest stretched out before us with its white stakes and its little red flags snapping in the wind, and the whole of the realm's marksmanship had gathered to shoot before the crown. I was 22 years old, a nobody from the river country with a borrowed coat and a rifle older than my father, and I thought I had come to lose quietly and go home. Instead, I had come to witness the proudest day of my life, though I did not know it yet, because I did not yet know the man in the red tunic. My name is Tobin Ashler. I am a witness, nothing more. I never won a thing that day, but I stood close enough to the green ribbon to see how it was earned, and I have spent the rest of my life telling people what restraint looks like when it finally lifts a rifle, so they will not make the mistake that the laughing men made. Let me tell it properly from the beginning, the way it happened. The Queen's Jubilee marksmanship contest came once in every reign worth marking, and Queen Saraland had decreed that hers would be open, not closed to the great houses, not reserved for the regiments with their gold braid and their famous names, open. Any subject of Eldermoor who could put coin to the entry fee, and a ball to a target might come to the great green below Harrogate Palace and shoot for the Queen's own prize. It was the talk of every tavern from the coast to the high passes. Some said it was a fine and generous thing, the kind of thing that made the people love the house of Harrogate. Others, the kind who fancied themselves marksmen, grumbled that it would clutter the line with farmers and fools and water down the glory. Lord Castellan Pyrrhal was firmly of the second opinion, and he said so loudly, often, and to anyone who would not walk away fast enough. I had ridden 4 days to get there, sleeping under hedgerows, my grandfather's rifle wrapped in oilcloth and slung across my back like a holy relic. I'm not ashamed to say I wept a little when I crested the last hill and saw Harrogate for the first time, the pale stone towers, the gilded railings catching the morning, the great green spread out below it like a length of dark velvet, dotted already with the tents and pavilions of the contestants. I had never seen so many people in one place. I had never seen so much wealth worn so casually, and I had certainly never seen anything like Lord Pyrrhal. He arrived on the first morning of the trials in a coach lacquered the color of a beetle's wing, drawn by 4 matched greys, with a retinue of perhaps a dozen loaders, polishers, a man whose only task seemed to be carrying a velvet cushion on which lay a pair of pistols nobody would shoot, and 3 young gentlemen of his own circle who laughed when he laughed and frowned when he frowned, and were, I came to understand, the worst of the lot. Pyrrhal himself was a tall man, broad and golden, handsome in the heavy way of men who have eaten well their whole lives and ridden good horses, and never once been told no. He wore a hunting coat of bottle green that must have cost more than my village earned in a season, and across his chest he wore the medals of 3 previous contests. One, he reminded us constantly, against fields far finer than this rabble. "Look at them," he said that first morning loud enough to carry. He stood at the head of the line with his glass to his eye, surveying the assembled contestants the way a butcher surveys a pen. "Ploughmen, pot shooters, a man in clogs, by my soul. The Queen, bless her tender heart, has turned the King's contest into a country fair." His friends tittered. "Well, let them come. It only makes the winning sweeter, to do it before an audience that has never seen it done." I kept my head down and oiled my rifle and said nothing, because that is what you do when a great man is unkind in your hearing, and you are nobody. I have since regretted, all my life, that I did not have the courage that one man on that green had, the man who answered Pyrrhal's contempt not with a word, but with the most perfect silence I have ever heard. He was standing at the far end of the line, apart from the rest of us, and at first I did not understand what I was looking at. A king's guard, in the full ceremonial dress of the household foot, The red wool tunic so deep it was almost the color of old wine, the brass buttons in their double row burning in the sun, the tall black bearskin, the white gloves, a row of metal ribbons across his breast. He stood at the firing line as though he were standing his post at the palace gate, spine straight, chin level, eyes forward, hands at rest. He did not look at the targets. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Lord Pirrell, who was the only man on that green not looking at him. I had seen the king's guard before, of course, from a great distance. On the one occasion I had been near the capital. They were a marvel and a mystery to country folk like me, those motionless men in red who guarded the royal house and never spoke and never flinched, who would stand in driving rain or blazing sun and never so much as turn their heads, who were, we said in the villages, more statue than man. Children dared each other to make them laugh. Tourists posed beside them and pulled faces. They never moved. That was the whole of what I knew about them, that they did not move and that they did not break. What in the name of all the saints, I thought, is one of them doing on the firing line of a shooting contest? He had a rifle, that was the strangest part. It was a long, plain, blued steel target rifle, not a ceremonial weapon at all, and it rested in the crook of his arm with the easy familiarity of a tool a man has carried for years. But everything else about him said palace, said gate, said do not move, and the contrast was so strange that men were beginning to point. A king's guard, in full dress, entered in the queen's contest. I heard the whispers start to ripple down the line. Was it a jest? A piece of pageantry the palace had arranged, a costume. Had the man wandered out of his post and got lost? Lord Pirrell lowered his glass. He had finally found something more amusing than the ploughmen and the pot shooters. "Now this," he said, "this is the finest thing I have seen all morning." He strolled down the line toward the guard, his three friends trailing behind him like the tail of a comet, and the whole green seemed to lean in to listen. "Tell me, my fine fellow, are you lost? Has the gate run away from you?" His friends laughed on cue. "Or has Her Majesty sent us a decoration for the firing line, a bit of color for the country folk to admire?" The guard did not answer. He did not even turn his head. He looked down the lane at the distant targets, level and unhurried, exactly as he had been looking before Pirrell spoke, exactly as though Pirrell had not spoken at all. And Lord Castellan Pirrell, the finest sportsman in Eldermoor, threw back his golden head and laughed, the loud, easy, cruel laughter of a man who has never once in his life been made to feel small, and who has therefore never learned that the quietest man at the table is very often the most dangerous. I have distrusted laughter on a shooting range ever since. Let me tell you how the contest was made, because you cannot understand what happened at its end unless you understand the shape of it. The Queen's Jubilee was run over 4 days. The first day was the trials. Every contestant fired a single string of 5 shots at a target 100 paces distant, and only those who put all 5 within the inner rings advanced. It was meant to thin the field, to send home the men who had paid their fee out of hope rather than skill, and it did. Of the near 200 who came to the green that first morning, fewer than 50 would shoot on the second day. The second day narrowed the targets and lengthened the lane. The third day brought the wind into it, and the moving marks, and the cruel small targets that separated the good from the great. And the fourth day, the day the Queen herself would sit beneath the gold awning at the head of the green with the whole court around her, and the prince and princess at her side. That day was for the last handful of marksmen left standing, who would shoot the final strings for the Queen's prize and the title of first rifle of the Jubilee. The prize itself was a thing men spoke of in lowered voices, a purse of gold, yes, but more than that, a commission. The first rifle of the Jubilee would be offered a place, a real place, a posting of honor in whichever of the crown's services he chose. For a great lord like Pirrell it meant little. He had places enough. But for a man like me, or for any of the farmers and foresters and gamekeepers on that line, it was the door to another life entirely. That was why they had come from every corner of the realm, not for the gold, for the door. I tell you all this so you understand the stakes, and so you understand why the men who shot well were so fierce about it, and why a king's guard standing silent at the line was such a riddle. The contest was deadly serious. And here was a man in a costume, apparently, who would not even answer when he was spoken to. The marshal of the contest was a gray old soldier named Captain Holloway, retired from the regiments, with a face like a cliff and a voice that carried the length of the green without ever seeming to rise. He ran the trials with a ledger and a brass bell, and not one word more than was needed. When Lord Peerl's laughter had finally died, it was Holloway who walked the length of the line to the guard, ledger in hand, and asked him quietly for his name and his entry. I was near enough to hear it just. "Vale," the guard said. It was the first word I heard him speak, and it was so low and so even that it seemed to come from a long way off. "Corporal Edrin Vale." Household foot. He produced a folded paper from inside his tunic, his entry, paid and stamped in good order. Holloway read it, made a mark in his ledger, and looked the guard up and down once, not unkindly, the way one old soldier reads another. "You'll shoot in those colors, Corporal?" Holloway asked. It was a fair question. No other man on the line was in uniform. We were in shooting coats and shirt sleeves, dressed for the work. "I'll shoot as I stand, sir," said Corporal Vale. Holloway looked at him a moment longer. Something passed over the old marshal's face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as though he had half recognized something and was deciding whether to say so. He decided not to. He made another mark in his ledger, said line 4 when the bell rings, and moved on. But I had seen that look, and I have wondered about it many times since. Holloway knew something. Holloway, alone among us that first morning, looked at the silent guard and saw not a costume but a man, and not just any man. Peerl, of course, had seen none of it. "Vale," he repeated, savoring it when the marshal had gone. "Corporal Vale of the household foot, a doorkeeper, a man whose whole trade is to stand very still and let tourists make faces at him." His friends were enjoying themselves enormously. The tallest of them, a sharp-faced young lord named Disrick, made a great show of standing at attention, chin up, eyes glassy, doing a cruel little impression of the motionless guard, and the others howled. "Tell me, Corporal," Peerl went on, "do they even let you load that thing, or is it for show like the rest of you? Is it a real rifle or a broomstick painted to look like one?" Corporal Vale looked down the lane at the targets. He did not answer. And that, I came to understand over the 4 days that followed, was the whole of his answer to everything. Vale did not argue. Vale did not defend himself. Vale did not rise to a single taunt, of which there were a great and growing number, because Peerl had found his sport for the Jubilee and meant to enjoy it to the dregs. When you insulted Corporal Vale, he looked at the targets. When you mocked his uniform, he looked at the targets. When you did your cruel little impression of him, he looked at the targets. He had, I think, made the targets the whole of his world, and there was simply no room in it for the men who laughed. I did not understand it then. I thought, the saints forgive me, that he must be slow or proud past sense, or perhaps a little broken in the way that old soldiers sometimes are. I thought a man who would let himself be mocked like that in front of the whole realm and not say a word must be a man with nothing in him to say. I was 22, I knew nothing. What I did not understand, what none of us understood, except perhaps gray old Holloway with his ledger, was that I was watching the single most disciplined human being I would ever meet do the only thing his life had trained him to do, which was to hold absolutely still in the face of a storm, and wait for the one moment when stillness was no longer the answer. The bell rang for the first string. Line 4 was called, and I forgot all about Corporal Edrin Vale because it was my turn to be afraid. I will be honest about my own shooting because it matters to the tale. I was good. I had been the best shot in my county since I was 15, which is a thing easy to be in a county of 3,000 souls, and a great deal harder to be on the green at Harrogate with the best of a whole kingdom standing at your elbow. My grandfather had taught me on that very rifle, a long flintlock with a curl of walnut in the stock, and a barrel he had freed of rust himself. A poor man's gun kept rich by care. He had been a forester and a poacher when the forester's wage ran thin, and he had taught me that a man who must feed his family on what he can hit does not get to miss. The gun does not care that you are poor, he used to say. The gun does not care that you are tired or cold or that your hands shake. The gun only does what your stillness tells it. So be still, Tobin. Be stiller than your fear. I thought of him as I stepped to line 4, and I tried to be stiller than my fear, and I did not entirely succeed. My first shot was good, a hand's breadth from center. My second was better. My third pulled wide as a gust came across the lane, and I felt my heart drop, but it caught the inner ring by the grace of the saints. And my fourth and fifth I steadied and placed honestly. And when the marker walked out to read my target and held up the count, I had all 5 within the inner rings. I had advanced. I stood there shaking, half blind with relief, and a few of the kinder men nearby clapped me on the shoulder, and I thought I might never feel anything so good again as long as I lived. That was the first day. I want you to understand that I earned my place on that green honestly, so that you will believe me when I tell you what I saw on the days that followed, because what I saw was past believing. There were men on that green worth knowing, and I came to know a few of them in the days of the contest, and they are part of the tale, for it was their honest on more than anything that first taught me to see what I was looking at. There was the forester I have mentioned, a great bear of a man named Bramwell, from the high northern woods, who had shot for the pot all his life and shot beautifully, and had never in 50 years been farther from his trees than the next valley, until the open Jubilee drew him down out of the hills with his old long gun and his slow, careful country way. There was a gamekeeper from the western marches, lean and weathered, who could call a hit before the smoke cleared. There was a fenman who shot wildfowl on the wing for the market and had hands like a surgeon. And there were the great lords and their famous rifles, Pyrrell chief among them, in their tailored coats with their loaders and their polishers and their easy contempt for the rest of us. It was Bramwell, the forester, who first put into words the thing the whole green came to feel. We stood together that first evening, watching the markers tear down the targets, and I said something young and foolish about how strange it was that a guardsman should enter, and Bramwell shook his great head slowly and said, "Strange, aye, but I'll tell you a stranger thing, lad. I watched him shoot today, and I've shot 50 years in the worst wind God ever made, in the high woods where a deer's your whole winter and a miss is a hungry one, and I tell you I have never once, not one time in all those years, seen a man put 5 balls through a single hole. I didn't know it could be done. I'd have called any man a liar who told me it could." He looked over to where the silent corporal sat alone by his tent. "I don't know who that is, but he's no doorkeeper. A doorkeeper doesn't shoot like that. Nobody shoots like that. Whatever that man is, he spent his whole life with a rifle in his hands, and not at any gate." And the big forester said it not with the Lord's contempt, but with the plain, generous, open-hearted wonder of a true craftsman recognizing a master of his own craft, and it shamed the Lord's laughter more than any rebuke could have, though they never heard it. I have thought since that this was the whole quiet meaning of Queen Saralyn's open contest. The lords in their closed world could not see veil, their pride had blinded them, but the common men, the foresters and the gamekeepers and the fenmen who lived by the rifle and knew in their bones what it could and could not do, they saw him at once. They saw him on the very first day. It took a man who had gone hungry on a miss to recognize a man who had never been allowed to miss. The Queen had opened her contest to the rabble, and it was the rabble, and only the rabble, who knew a hero when he stood among them in a borrowed coat. There is a lesson in that, about who truly sees and who is too high to see, and I have never forgotten it. That was the first day. The shooting was past believing, and the awe of the men who knew was past faking, and I went to my tent that night and lay awake a long while wondering about the silent man in the next canvas over, never dreaming I would come to know him, never dreaming what he was. The trials ran all that long, bright morning. Man after man stepped to the line, fired his string, and either advanced or gathered his things and went quietly home with his head down. Lord Pirrell, when his turn came, shot beautifully. There is no use pretending otherwise. The man was a true marksman, whatever else he was. He put all 5 shots into a cluster you could have covered with a wine cup, dead in the center, and he did it with a careless grace that made it look like nothing at all, and the crowd that had gathered to watch the great lord shoot gave him the applause he plainly expected. He bowed to them. He bowed to the empty gold awning where the queen would sit on the final day, as though already accepting his prize. And then he turned with his friends around him to watch Corporal Vale shoot, because that, of course, was the entertainment he had been waiting for all morning. The whole green watched. Word had gone round by now. The king's guard, the statue, the doorkeeper who would not speak, entered in the queen's contest in his full dress uniform. Men drifted over from the other lines. The crowd thickened. Pirrell's friends were already grinning, already nudging one another, already certain of the joke that was about to be delivered to them free of charge. Corporal Vale stepped to the line. He did it the way he did everything, without hurry and without flourish. He set the butt of his rifle to the ground and stood a moment, and then he raised it to his shoulder, and the change that came over him in that single motion is a thing I have never been able to fully describe to anyone who was not there. The stiff ceremonial figure, the statue, the man who stood his post, all of that did not vanish so much as it focused, the way a wide and scattered light narrows to a single burning point when you put a lens before it. Every part of him went still in a way that was different from the parade ground stillness of before. This was not the stillness of a man holding a pose. This was the stillness of a man who has made himself disappear, so that only the rifle remains. He fired 5 times. He did not rush between the shots, and he did not dawdle. There was a rhythm to it, a slow and terrible patience, each shot following the last like the tolling of a deep bell. Crack, a breath, crack, a breath. He did not lower the rifle to admire his work. He did not look to the crowd. When the 5th shot had gone, he held the rifle a moment longer, as though listening to something the rest of us could not hear, and then he set the butt to the ground and stood as he had stood before, eyes forward, and waited. The marker walked out to read his target. The marker stopped. The marker stood looking at the target for what seemed a very long time. Then he turned and looked back down the lane at Corporal Vale, and then he looked at his count board in his hand as though it had failed him, and then he called for Captain Holloway, which was not a thing the markers did. Holloway walked out to the target himself. I watched the old marshal bend over it, and I watched his cliff of a face, and though I was 100 paces off, I saw him go very still in his own way. He straightened. He looked back at Vale. He said something to the marker, who lifted the count board and showed it to the green. 5 shots, all 5 in the center ring, of course, but that was not what had made the marker stop. What had made the marker stop was that all 5 shots had gone through very nearly the same hole. Where Lord Pirrell's beautiful cluster could be covered with a wine cup, Corporal Vale's could be covered with a thumb. At 100 paces, with a plain rifle in the gusting wind, the silent doorkeeper had put 5 balls so close together that you could not be sure, looking at the ragged single hole he had made, whether you were seeing the work of 5 shots or 1. The green was very quiet for a moment. And then Lord Pirrell laughed again, but it was not quite the same laugh as before. There was something underneath it now, something that had not been there in the morning, and a man with a better ear than I had at 22 might have named it for what it was. It was the first thin thread of fear. He covered it well, I will give him that. A man does not become the first sportsman of a kingdom without learning how to wear a face. Pirrell let the laugh trail off into a shake of his golden head, as though the whole thing were merely a curiosity, a freak of luck, and he turned to his friends and said, loud enough for the green to hear, "Well, they say a blind hog finds an acorn now and again." Even a statue, it seems, can be pointed at a target and let off. Disrick and the others laughed dutifully, but I noticed. I was watching closely now, you understand. The silent guard had become the most interesting thing on the green to me as well. I noticed that the laughter came a half-beat late, and that one of the younger friends, a soft-faced boy named Wenlin, did not laugh at all but stood frowning at the ragged single hole in Vale's target with the dawning look of a man doing a sum and not liking the answer. "Luck," Pyrrell said again, to no one in particular, and walked away. But it was not luck, and on the second day every man on the green came to know it. The second day thinned the field hard. The targets were drawn back to 150 paces and shrunk to half their size, and the inner ring that a man had to fill was now no wider than a man's spread hand. The morning's relief of the first day curdled into the morning's dread of the second. I saw fine shooters, men far better than I, step to the line and watch their good shots scatter just wide enough to send them home. By the noon bell the fewer than 50 had become fewer than 20, and I, by some grace I still cannot account for, was among them. So was Lord Pyrrell, who shot another beautiful tight cluster and bowed to the crowd and the empty awning as before. And so was Corporal Edrin Vale, who stepped to the line in his red tunic with the whole green now watching him and not Pyrrell, and who put 5 shots through one hole again, at 150 paces, into a target half the size, as though the distance and the smallness were a matter of supreme indifference to him. This time no one called it luck. This time the green was silent when the marker held up the count, a different kind of silent than before, the silence of men who have just been shown a thing they did not know was possible, and are trying to fit it into their understanding of the world, and finding that it will not go. I heard a forester near me, a great bear of a man who had shot all his life in the high woods, mutter under his breath, "I have never seen the like. Not in 20 years on the range, not from any man." And he was right. None of us had ever seen the like. We had seen great shooting, Pyrrell's was great shooting, but this was something else, something past greatness, a quiet and absolute mastery so far beyond the rest of us that it did not even seem to belong to the same contest. And the man who owned it stood there in his ceremonial dress, eyes forward, saying nothing, as though he had not noticed that the green had gone silent, as though he had not noticed any of us at all. Lord Pyrrell noticed. By the end of the second day, Lord Pyrrell could think of very little else. You could see it working in him over those long bright hours, the slow turning of a proud man's mind as it confronts a thing it cannot dismiss. First it had been a joke. Then it had been luck. Now, on the second evening, with the field cut to 20 and the silent guard plainly the equal of anyone on the green and very possibly the better of them all, it had become a problem, and a man like Pyrrell did not endure problems. He solved them, and the way Pyrrell's kind of man solves the problem of a rival he cannot best with his own skill is the oldest and ugliest way there is. He sets out to break the rival's nerve, since he cannot break his aim. So the mockery, which had been idle sport on the first day, turned on the second into something with a purpose behind it. It grew sharper. It grew constant. Wherever Vale went on the green, to the water butt, to the armorer's bench, to the long table where the contestants took their bread and cheese at midday, Pyrrell or one of his friends was there to needle him. They mocked his silence, calling it stupidity. They mocked his uniform, asking whether he had a real coat or only the costume. They invented a whole running jest about the doorkeeper who had wandered out of the palace and could not find his way back to his post, and they performed it for anyone who would listen, and a certain number of people, I am sorry to say, laughed, because there are always people who will laugh at whatever the powerful man laughs at. Through all of it, Corporal Vale drank his water, ate his bread, oiled his rifle, and looked at nothing in particular with the perfect blank composure of a man standing his post at the palace gate while the whole world makes faces at him. There was one moment on that second day, though, when his composure was tested past anything Pyrrell himself had managed, and it is worth the telling, for it showed me the iron beneath the stillness more plainly than the shooting did. It was the sharp-faced young lord, Disrick, the one who did the cruel little impression, who tried it. Emboldened by his master and tired, I suppose, of getting no rise out of the silent man, Disrick decided that the way to crack the statue was not with words but with his hands, and he chose the one thing a marksman holds most sacred. He waited until Vale had set his rifle on the armorer's bench to take his midday bread, and then he sauntered over, all idle malice, and picked up the corporal's rifle without leave, picked it up by the muzzle, swung it carelessly about, peered down the barrel with one squinting eye in mocking imitation of taking aim, and said, loud for the gathering crowd, "So this is the famous broomstick. Tell me, statue, does it come with a label? Property of His Majesty's furniture." And he made as if to sight it at the distant targets, swinging the muzzle round, handling another man's weapon with the contemptuous carelessness of a child handling a toy. Now I had grown up around rifles, and I knew at once that two lines had been crossed at the same instant, and that either alone was a grave thing. To touch another marksman's weapon uninvited is an insult of the deepest kind on any range in the realm. A man's rifle is his honor and his livelihood and very nearly his soul, and you no more lay hands on it without leave than you would lay hands on his wife. That was the first line. The second was worse, and it was the one that made my blood run cold. Disrick, in his ignorant clowning, was swinging a loaded, or possibly loaded, he could not know, which was the whole horror of it, rifle about in a crowd, muzzle sweeping across the bodies of 24 people, his finger near the trigger, in the careless way of a man who has never once been taught that a gun is not a toy and does not forgive. And Corporal Edrin Vale moved. It was the first time in 2 days I had seen him move with anything but his slow patience, and it was so fast that I scarcely saw it at all. One moment he was seated at his bread, the next he was simply there beside Disrick, and his white-gloved hand had closed over the lock of the rifle and the trigger both, gently, without a snatch, without a struggle, and he had turned the muzzle, not wrenched it, turned it, smooth and inexorable as a tide up and away, toward the empty sky over the range where a wandering ball could harm no one. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike the young lord or shove him or shame him. He simply took control of the weapon, all of it, lock and muzzle and the careless hand that held it, and made it safe. And he did it so quietly and so completely that half the crowd did not even understand that anything had happened. But Disrick understood. Disrick found himself suddenly holding a rifle he no longer controlled, his hand pinned gently but utterly beneath a white glove that had moved faster than his eye could follow, the muzzle pointing at nothing but air, and he looked up into the corporal's face and went pale. "It's loaded," Vale said, just that, low and even for Disrick's ears, though I was near enough to hear. "I always keep it loaded. A man who carries a rifle and doesn't keep it ready has forgotten what it's for. You were sweeping a loaded rifle across 40 living souls, my lord, with your finger on the trigger because you wanted to make a crowd laugh." He took the rifle fully out of the young man's slack hands as he spoke and set it back on the bench, muzzle safe. "Mock me as you please. I've a thick hide. But you'll not handle a loaded weapon like a fool where there are people, not while I'm by to stop it. Someone could have died for your joke. Think on that the next time you find me funny." And he sat back down to his bread. Disrick stood there a moment, white and shaking, and then he turned and walked away very fast and did not come back, and he did no more impressions of the statue for the rest of the Jubilee. I have always thought that it was not the rebuke that did it, but the speed. In that one instant the young lord had felt, in the iron grip that closed over his hand before he knew it was coming, exactly how badly he had misjudged the man he was laughing at. You do not move like that with that certainty, that economy, that absolute mastery of a weapon and the hand that holds it, unless you have done it 10,000 times in circumstances a great deal worse than a sunny afternoon at a country contest. Disrick had reached out to touch a statue and found under the paint something that moved like a coiled spring and spoke like the calm at the center of a storm, and it frightened him, as well it might. It frightened me, and I was only watching. It was the first crack, I think, in the whole Green's certainty that the silent man was a fool. The shooting had made them wonder. The thing with the rifle made a few of them afraid. And fear, in a crowd, is the beginning of respect. It was on the second evening that I finally spoke to him. I had not meant to. I was a nobody and he was a marvel, and I had no business pushing my company on a man who plainly wanted none. But the contestants slept in a long row of tents at the edge of the green, the great lords in their fine pavilions and the rest of us in plain canvas, and I found that my plain canvas had been pitched, by the luck of the draw, beside the plain canvas of Corporal Edrin Vale, who, for all that men called him a doorkeeper and a statue, had been given no pavilion and no retinue, and slept among the farmers and the foresters like one of us. He was sitting outside his tent in the long gold evening, his red tunic unbuttoned at the throat at last, cleaning his rifle by hand. And I, who had been raised to mind my own business, found that I could not. I had to know. "That was the finest shooting I ever saw," I said. "Today, and yesterday I had to say it. I'm sorry to trouble you." He looked up at me. It was the first time I had seen his eyes properly, and they were not the eyes of a stupid man or a broken one. They were dark and quiet and very steady, and there was something behind them that I could not name then but can name now. They were the eyes of a man who has seen a great deal that he does not speak of, and who carries it without complaint, the way a strong man carries a heavy thing as though it were light. "You shot well yourself," he said. "Line 4, both days, steady hands for a young man on a big green." I was astonished that he had noticed me at all. You saw me shoot." "I see everyone shoot," he said. "It's a habit. Sit if you like." So I sat, on the grass beside the most disciplined man I would ever meet, and over the next hour in the long gold light, I came to know Corporal Edrin Vale a little, not because he volunteered much, for he did not, but because I was young and full of questions, and he was patient with them in his quiet way, answering what he chose to answer and letting the rest go by. He told me he had shot since he was a boy, younger than I had been, on a hard scrabble of upland farm where the rabbits were the difference between a full winter and a thin one. He told me a little about the household foot, about what it meant to stand a post, that it was not nothing, whatever the lords thought, that to stand still for hours while the world jostled and jeered and the rain ran down your neck was its own kind of discipline, and that the men who could do it were not the men who felt nothing but the men who had learned to set their feeling aside until it was needed. "Anyone can move," he said. "The hard thing is to be still. The hard thing is to hold and hold and hold and not break, and then to know the one moment when holding is no longer the right thing, and to move at exactly that moment and no other." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but it has stayed with me my whole life, because I came to understand that he was describing not only how to stand a post but how to shoot, and not only how to shoot but how to live. I asked him, because I was young and rude, why he let Pyrrhal mock him so, why he did not answer back, why he did not, at the very least, point out that his shooting had silenced the green twice over, and that the great lord's was only the second best on it. He was quiet for a while, working oil into the lock of his rifle. "A man who answers an insult," he said at last, "has let the man who gave it choose the ground. He's fighting on the other fellow's chosen field on the other fellow's terms. I don't care to do that." He set the lock and turned the rifle in the light, checking it. "And a man who needs to tell you he can shoot," he added more quietly, "usually can't. The shooting answers for itself. It doesn't need my mouth to help it. So I keep my mouth shut and let the targets talk. They're more eloquent than I am." I have thought about that 1,000 times. The shooting answers for itself. I asked him then, because the wine of the evening and the kindness of his patience had made me bolder than I had any right to be, whether he had always been a guardsman, whether standing a gate was the whole of the life he had had. It was a clumsy question, the kind a young man asks without knowing he is reaching for a door that ought to be knocked on, not flung open, and Corporal Vale did not answer it at once. He worked oil into the lock of his rifle, and he looked off across the darkening green to where the last light was going out of the high country behind the palace. And when he spoke at last, he did not answer the question I had asked, but a deeper one underneath it. "There was a time," he said, "when I was younger than you are now, that I thought being good with a rifle was the finest thing a man could be. I'd grown up poor and hungry more winters than not, and the rifle was the one thing in the whole world I was better at than anybody around me. You understand what that means to a poor boy. It means everything. It means you are not nothing after all. So I followed the rifle where it led me, because it was all I had, and it led me into hard country and hard work, and a hard time in the history of this realm that you are too young to remember and that I will not lay on you tonight." He set the lock and turned the rifle in the dusk, checking the line of it by feel more than sight. And I was good. Saints forgive me, I was as good as the rifle had promised, and better. And I learned a thing in that hard country that I have spent the rest of my life trying to make sense of. He was quiet so long, I thought he would not go on. "I learned that a great gift is a heavy thing to carry," he said. "Heavier than no gift at all, because the world finds a use for it, you see, and the use the world finds is not always the use you'd have chosen, and you do not always get to say no. I did things with this gift in that hard time that needed doing, I'll say that much and stand by it, for they did need doing, and men I loved would have died who didn't if I hadn't done them. But a man does not come home from such things, the same man who went out. And when it was over and I came home, I found I could not bear to pick up a rifle for the longest while, because every time I did, my hands knew things I did not want them to know." He looked at me then in the near dark, and his quiet eyes were very steady. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, lad?" I did not wholly, not at 22. But I understood enough to be still and listen, and that, I think, was what he wanted. "I'm telling you," he said gently, "that the men out there who laugh at me, Pirrell and his sort, they think a rifle is a toy and shooting is a game, and the worst thing that can happen at a contest is that you lose. They have never carried the gift anywhere it weighs anything, and I don't hate them for it. I not wish on any man the weight that taught me different. Let them keep their game. But you'll understand why I can't be made to care the way they care, whether I win their little contest or lose it. I've shot for things that mattered more than gold, Tobin, more than a title, more than a crowd's cheering, and once you've done that, the cheering and the gold and the title go very quiet. They stop being able to reach you. That's what they see when they look at me and call it dullness or pride or a slow wit. It isn't any of those. It's only a man who has learned what the rifle is really for and can't unlearn it, and so can't be made to play the game as though it were the whole of the world. Because it isn't. It never was. I have carried those words for 50 years, and they have grown truer to me with every one of them. The men who mock are the men who have never carried anything heavy, and the silence they take for emptiness is very often the deepest fullness there is, a man so weighted with what he knows that the small noises of the world simply cannot move him. He had told me that evening in his roundabout way very nearly everything except the name of it. I did not understand that yet, but I understood that I had been led a little way into a man most people never saw past the red coat, and I was grateful, and I held my tongue and let him be. The shooting answers for itself. It was as he finished speaking that my eye fell in the last of the light on the row of metal ribbons on his unbuttoned tunic, and on one in particular, set a little apart from the rest, a faded green ribbon, narrow and plain, the green long since gone soft and gray at the edges with age and weather. It did not look like the bright ceremonial ribbons beside it. It looked old. It looked like a thing that had been somewhere. And because he had just spoken of a hard country and a weight he could not set down, I asked him, before I could think better of it, what it was. For the first time, Corporal Vale went still in a way that was not his usual stillness, just for a moment. Then he buttoned his tunic to the throat, covering the ribbons, and stood. "It's late," he said. "You'll want your sleep before the third day. The wind comes tomorrow." And he ducked into his tent, and that was all I got of the green ribbon that second evening, a moment's stillness and a closed flap of canvas. But I had seen the way he touched it, and I had seen the way he went quiet, and I knew, the way you know a thing without being told, that the green ribbon was the heart of him, that whatever it was, it mattered more than all the bright metals beside it put together. I went to sleep that night turning it over in my mind, and I dreamed of ragged single holes in distant targets, and I woke before dawn to the sound the whole field had been dreading and the silent corporal had foretold. The wind had come. It came down off the high ground behind the palace in long, uneven gusts, bending the range flags flat and then letting them fall and then snapping them flat the other way, so that a man at the line could never be sure, from one breath to the next, what the air between him and his target was doing. It is the cruelest condition there is for a marksman. A still day rewards a steady hand. A windy day mocks it. The ball leaves the barrel true and the wind takes it, lifts it or pushes it or drops it, and there is no skill of the hands that can wholly answer it. Only the deeper skill, the rarer one, of reading the air itself, of watching the flags and the grass and the dust and the very light, and knowing in your bones before you fire what the wind will do to the ball and holding off for it. Few men have that skill. Most who think they have it are wrong, and the wind finds them out. My grandfather had it in his way, bred into him by 50 winters of shooting for the potting country where a missed shot meant a hungry child, and he had tried to pass it to me, and some of it had taken. The flags lie, he used to tell me. The flags only show you the wind where the flags are. The ball flies through all the wind between you and the mark, and most of that wind you cannot see at all. So you learn to read the wind you cannot see, by the grass far off, by the way the light moves on it, by the birds, by the feel of it on the back of your neck, by 100 small things you cannot name and only know in your bones after years. And even then, he would add with the grim honesty of his trade, even then the wind will beat you 1 time in 10, and you must make your peace with that because no man beats the wind every time. No man living. I had believed him. I had thought it the plain truth, the limit of what any human hand could do. And then I watched Corporal Vale on the 3rd day beat the wind not 1 time in 10 but 5 times in 5, and I understood that my grandfather, wise as he was, had simply never in his life stood near enough to a true master to know what the limit really was. There are men who do the thing the rest of us call impossible, quietly, as a matter of course, and never think to mention that it is impossible, because to them it is only Tuesday. I was watching one of them. I did not yet know how rare a thing that was. I know now. I have shot and watched shooting for 50 years since all over this realm, and I have never seen its equal, not once, not from any man. The 3rd day, then, was the day the wind was supposed to be the great leveler, the day that would prove the silent corporal mortal after all. Instead, it became the day that proved him something more than mortal, at least with a rifle in his hands. The 3rd day found a great many men out. The field of 20 was to be cut to the last handful who would shoot on the 4th day before the Queen, and the wind did the cutting with a savage hand. Fine shooters, men who had put up tight clusters on the still days, watched their shots stagger wide and wild and went home baffled and ashamed. The forester, the great bear of a man who had shot all his life in the high woods, did better than most. The woods teach a man about wind, but even he scattered 2 shots out of his string and stood looking at his target with the stunned face of a man betrayed by his own gift. I myself shot the string of my life that morning, every ounce of my grandfather's teaching brought to bear, watching the flags, holding off, being stiller than my fear, and I scraped through by a single ball, my last shot catching the very edge of the ring as a gust died at the perfect instant, more by luck than reading. I knew it, even as the marker waved me through. I had not read the wind. The wind had simply, for 1 shot, taken pity on me. Lord Pyrrhal did not need pity. I will say it again because it is true and because it makes what followed mean more. The man could shoot. He read the wind better than anyone left on the green save one, holding off for the gusts with a practiced eye, and he put up a string good enough to carry him through to the final day with room to spare. He bowed to the crowd. He bowed to the empty awning. He was, by the third evening, one of the last 5 marksmen standing in the Queen's Jubilee, and he knew that the final day would bring him before the Queen herself, and his pride was a great golden fire in him that the wind could not touch. But there was one thing the wind could not touch either, and it was not Lord Peerl's pride. When Corporal Vale stepped to the line on the third day, the flags were snapping flat in a hard gust, and a low murmur went through the watching green, because every man there now understood what the silent guard could do on a still day, and every man there wanted to see whether the wind would finally find him out as it had found out all the rest. Even I, who had sat beside him and heard him speak of stillness, even I wondered. The wind humbles everyone, I thought. It will humble him too. It must. It did not. He stood at the line longer than usual before he raised the rifle. He was watching. I understood that now, having heard him speak. He was reading the air, watching the flags and the grass and the long ripples the wind drew across the green, taking the measure of a thing the rest of us could only flinch from. And when he raised the rifle at last, he did not fire at once. He waited. He waited through one gust and into the brief sag of dying air behind it, and in that sag he fired, and then he waited again, through the next gust, and fired again in the lull behind it, so that his whole string was a slow, patient dance with the wind, each shot placed not when he was ready but when the air was, each crack of the rifle following a gust like an answer following a question. 5 shots. And when the marker walked out to read the target, through the wind, mind you, at 150 paces, on the day that had broken half the field, the marker stopped and stood and turned and called for Holloway, exactly as on the first day. All 5 in the center, the cluster a little wider than on the still days, for no man living can wholly beat the wind, but tighter by far than any other string fired on that cruel morning, tighter than Peerl's, tighter than anything any of us had thought possible in such air. The silent doorkeeper had not merely survived the wind. He had mastered it. He had stood in the condition that humbles every marksman alive, and he had shot as though the wind were a thing he kept as a pet. This time the green did not stay silent. This time a sound went up from the watching crowd that had never gone up for any of us, not applause exactly, but something rower and more honest, a great low sound of wonder, the sound a crowd makes when it has been shown something it will tell its grandchildren about. The farmers and the foresters and the gamekeepers, the very rabble Peerl had sneered at, looked at the man in the red tunic with open awe. And I saw more than one of them glance over at Lord Peerl, and then back at Vale, and I saw the question forming on their plain, honest faces, the question that would not be unasked now however hard the great lord laughed. Which of these two is the better man with a rifle? And the answer, the green now plainly knew, was not the golden lord in the bottle green coat. It was the silent statue everyone had laughed at. Before I come to the wager, I must tell you of the exhibition, for it was on the third evening, between the wind day and the final day, that Lord Peerl made his last and most public attempt to take back the green by other means than skill. And it was at the exhibition that I first saw the silent corporal move to do a thing he had not been provoked into, a thing he chose, and chose for a reason that told me more about him than 4 days of his silence had. It was the custom of the Jubilee, on the eve of the final day, to hold an exhibition of fancy shooting for the crowds who had gathered below the palace. The townsfolk and the merchants and the families come up from the country to see the great contest, who would not be admitted to the firing line on the final morning, but who pressed against the cords all the long days, drawn by the spectacle. The exhibition was not part of the contest proper. It counted for nothing in the score. It was a show, pure and simple, a chance for the great marksmen to perform the kind of dazzling trick shots that have no place in serious competition, but make a crowd roar, splitting a willow wand at 50 paces, snuffing a candle flame without touching the wick, breaking a spinning clay disc tossed into the air. The contestants were not required to take part, But the famous ones always did, for the love of the crowd, and Lord Pyrrhal, who loved a crowd above almost anything, had made the exhibition his own for 3 contests running. He was magnificent at it. I will say so plainly, for the last time, and then I will say no more in his praise. He stood before the great press of common folk that 3rd evening, and he did things with his beautiful rifle that drew gasp after gasp. He cut a thread and dropped the weight that hung from it. He broke discs his loader flung high against the gold of the evening sky. He put out 3 candle flames in a row down the length of a table without marking one wick. The crowd adored him. He fed on their adoration the way a fire feeds on dry wood, and the more they roared the more he gave them. And at the height of it, flushed and golden and beloved, he turned to where Corporal Vale stood at the edge of the crowd watching, and he made his last play for the green. "Corporal," he called, his voice ringing out over the press of people, all good humor now, all generous invitation, the very picture of a great man magnanimously including a lesser one. "Will you not give the good people a turn? They have heard you can shoot a tight group at a paper. Anyone can shoot a paper, it doesn't move, it doesn't fight back. But this," he gestured grandly at the candles, the discs, the willow wands, "this is the sport of a true marksman. Come. Show them what the household foot can do when it isn't standing still." And the crowd, who did not know the man and only knew that the great lord was inviting the strange guardsman to play, took it up with a will, calling for the corporal, clapping, urging him forward, in perfect innocence of the trap that had been laid. For it was a trap and a cunning one. Pyrrhal had judged rightly that the fancy shooting was a different art from the contest shooting, that a man might be a master of the still cold work of putting 15 balls through one hole, and yet be all thumbs at the showy, sudden, crowd-pleasing trick shots, which reward a different gift entirely. He meant for Vale to come forward and fumble. He meant for the crowd's adoration to curdle into laughter when the silent guardsman missed an easy candle or muffed a thrown disc, and he meant to take back, before the common folk at least, the standing he had lost on the firing line. It was clever. I did not see it until later, but it was very clever and very cruel, and it nearly worked, because Corporal Vale, who had refused every taunt for 3 days, did not refuse this. He stepped forward into the open before the crowd. My heart sank. I thought, he has finally been caught, he has let pride do what insult could not, and now I will watch the great trickshot artist make a fool of him before the very people who cheered him this morning. I could not bear to watch, and I could not look away. But the corporal did not pick up a rifle. He walked instead to the table of candles, the ones Pyrrhal had just so brilliantly snuffed, and he found among them 3 that had not yet been lit, and he asked the exhibition master quietly for a light. And then, this is the thing I have never forgotten, he did not shoot the candles out. He lit them. He lit all 3, carefully, shielding each new flame with his white-gloved hand against the evening breeze, and he set them in a row at the very edge of the table nearest the crowd, where the children pressed against the cords could see them, and he stepped back, and he raised the borrowed rifle, and he said, in his low, even voice that somehow carried over the whole hushed press of people, "My lord put these flames out. That's a hard thing and a fine one, and he did it beautifully." A pause. "I'd sooner show the little ones a harder thing. I'll trim the wicks." And he fired 3 times, and with each shot he clipped the long black wick of a burning candle clean off just above the flame, so that the flame leapt and steadied and went on burning, brighter for the trimming, every one of the 3 still lit. He had shot away the dead wick from a living flame 3 times running without putting out the fire, a shot so much finer and so much more difficult than snuffing the candle that the exhibition master, an old hand who had seen every trick on every range in the realm, simply sat down where he stood. And the candles burned on, 3 small steady flames in the gold of the evening, and the crowd did not roar. The crowd was silent, and then the crowd wept. I did not understand it at first, the silence and the tears, where Pyrrhal's brilliance had earned only roars. I understood it later. Pyrrhal had shown them destruction made beautiful, the flame put out, the thread cut, the disc shattered. It was dazzling and it was hollow, and a crowd roars at it and goes home empty. Vale had shown them something else. He had taken the same impossible skill and turned it not to putting out the light but to saving it, to cutting away the dead thing so the living flame might burn the brighter. And he had done it, he said, for the little ones, so that the children pressed against the cords might see that a great gift could be used to keep a small flame alive rather than to snuff it. And the common folk who had no learning but had hearts, understood in their hearts exactly what they had been shown, even if they could not have put words to it, and it moved them past cheering, all the way to tears. That is the difference between the two men, told in 3 candles. I have never found a better way to tell it. Lord Castellan Pyrrhus stood at the edge of his own exhibition, and watched the crowd he had won 3 years running weep for another man, and he understood, I think, in that moment, that he had lost something that no 4th victory at the firing line could win back. And it was then, I am certain, that he went away and made his ugly plan for the wager, and quite possibly his uglier plan for the rifle in the night. For a proud man who cannot win a crowd's heart will very often settle for breaking the man who took it. Lord Castellan Pyrrhus was not a stupid man, and he could read a crowd as well as he could read the wind. He felt the green turn. He felt the awe that had been his alone for 3 contests and a dozen years drift across the lane and settle on the silent corporal, and he felt it the way a man feels the first cold drop of a storm he has been pretending was not coming. A smaller man might have made his peace with it. A better man might have walked across the green and offered the corporal his hand and said, "You are the finer shot, sir, and I am glad to have stood the line beside you." There are such men. I have met a few in my long life. Lord Pyrrhus was not one of them. What Pyrrhus did on the 3rd evening was decide that if he could not beat the corporal with skill before the wondering crowd, he would beat him with shame before the queen. He came to find Vale at the long table where the last 5 marksmen took their evening bread. He came with his friends around him, and with a crowd trailing after, because word had gone round that the great lord had something to say, and Pyrrhus never said anything that he did not first make sure of his audience for. He stood across the table from the silent corporal, and he smiled his easy golden smile, and the green leaned in to listen. "Corporal Vale," he said, "I find I have misjudged you, truly. You shoot well, you shoot like a man who has done little else with his life, which I suppose is no great wonder in a fellow whose only other trade is standing still." A ripple of laughter from his friends. "But credit where it is owed, you shoot well. And so I have a proposal for you, between sportsmen." Vale went on eating his bread. He did not answer, but he did not need to. The silence was answer enough, and Pyrrhus, who could not abide silence, rushed to fill it. "Tomorrow we shoot before Her Majesty," Pyrrhus said. "The 5 of us for the Queen's prize and the first rifle of the Jubilee. A great honor, a great audience." His smile widened. "So let us make it interesting, you and I a wager. A side bet between gentlemen or between a gentleman and a doorkeeper, which I suppose is near enough for sport." More laughter. "If you outshoot me tomorrow before the Queen, I will pay you 100 gold crowns, a fortune for a man of your station. More than your uniform will earn you in 10 years of standing at a gate." The crowd murmured. 100 crowns was a vast sum, a life-changing sum for any common man. "And if I outshoot you," Pyrrhus went on, and here his voice changed, here the easy gold went out of it and something harder showed underneath. "You will do one small thing for me before the Queen and the whole court. You will lay down that rifle, and you will take off that costume you are so proud of, that pretty red coat down to your shirt, corporal, here on the green, and you will admit, aloud before Her Majesty and all her court and every farmer on this field, that you are exactly what you appear to be. A doorkeeper, a statue, a man fit to stand still and be laughed at and nothing more. You will say it loud, and you will say it clear, and then you will go back to your gate where you belong and trouble your betters no further." The green had gone very quiet. It was a cruel thing he had proposed, calculated to humiliate, to strip the silent man of the one dignity he had left, his composure, and to do it at the worst possible moment before the crown. And it was cunning, too, in its cruelty, for Pyrrhus had judged that the corporal could not refuse without seeming to lack confidence in his own shooting, and could not accept without putting his pride in the hands of a single windy morning and the great lord's own considerable skill. I was standing close. I wanted to shout at him not to do it. I wanted to stand up and tell the whole green what a small and ugly thing the great lord had just done. I was 22, and I had no standing to do any such thing, and I knew it, and the not doing of it shames me still. Corporal Vale set down his bread. He looked at Lord Pyrrhus for a long, level moment, and for the first time in 3 days, something moved in his quiet, dark eyes, not anger, exactly. Something more like recognition, as though Pyrrhus were a kind of man he had met before and knew the shape of entirely. "I'll not take your 100 crowns, he said. His voice was low and even as always, but the whole green heard it because the whole green had gone silent to hear it. "I've no use for them, and I'll not be paid to shoot. A man who shoots for money soon shoots for whoever pays the most." Pyrrhus' smile flickered. "Then you decline, as I thought. The statute talks a great deal about." "I didn't say I decline," said Vale. The green held its breath. "I'll shoot you tomorrow," the corporal said, "before the queen as you like, and I'll take no gold for it, win or lose, but I'll make you a different wager since you're so fond of them." He stood slowly, and he was not a large man, not beside the golden bulk of Pyrrhus, but something about the way he stood made the great lord seem suddenly the smaller of the two. "If you outshoot me tomorrow," Vale said, "I'll lay down my rifle and admit before the queen that I am exactly what you say I am, and I'll never trouble you again. You have my word, and my word is good. But if I outshoot you," and here, for the first time in 3 days, the faintest thing that was almost a smile touched the corner of the silent man's mouth, "you'll say nothing. You'll make no speech. You'll do no honor and pay no gold. You'll simply stand quiet at the line before the queen and all her court and every farmer on this green and learn what it is to hold your tongue. One day. That's all I ask of you. One single day of the silence you've mocked in me for 3. Can you do it, my lord? Can you be still?" There was a sound from the green then, a low sound, half a gasp and half a laugh, the sound of a crowd that has just watched the silent man it underestimated turn the great lord's own cruelty back upon him as neatly as a swordsman turning a blade. Pyrrhus' golden face went a dull and ugly red. He had been outmaneuvered before his own audience by a doorkeeper, and he knew it, and there was no way back out of it that did not cost him more than going forward. "Done," he said through his teeth. "Tomorrow before the queen." "Tomorrow," said Corporal Vale, and he picked up his bread again, and he went on eating, as though nothing of any importance had occurred. I could not sleep that night. I lay in my plain canvas tent beside his, listening to the wind worry the flags out on the dark green, and I turned the wager over and over in my mind. I believed in him. By then I believed in him with my whole heart, but belief is a thin blanket on a cold night, and I could not stop thinking of all the ways a single windy morning might go wrong, of the edge of luck I had ridden through the wind myself that day, of the terrible public price the silent man had agreed to pay if the air betrayed him before the crown. He had wagered his last dignity on the wind. It seemed to me a mad thing to do, and I could not understand why a man so careful in everything else would do it. It was near midnight when I heard low voices outside, and I lifted the flap of my tent a hand's breadth and looked out. Corporal Vale sat outside his tent in the dark as before, but he was not alone. Captain Holloway, the gray old marshal of the contest, sat on the grass beside him, and the two of them were speaking quietly, the way men speak when they do not wish to be heard. I should not have listened. I know that. But I was young and afraid for him, and I listened, and I have never been sorry because what I heard that night changed how I understood the whole of it. "Recognized you the first morning," Holloway was saying low. "The moment you gave your name. I served with men who served under you, Vale. I've heard the stories. Every soldier in the regiments has heard the stories." And I stood there with my ledger looking at a man the whole green was calling a doorkeeper, and I knew exactly who you were, and I held my tongue because I judged you wanted it held. Was I right? You were right, said Vale. I'd take it as a kindness if you go on holding it, until tomorrow at least. You could have ended it the first day, Holloway said. One word. You could have told that golden fool who you are and watched the laughter die in his throat and never been mocked again. Why in heaven's name didn't you? There was a long quiet. Because the man who needs to tell you who he is, Vale said at last, has already lost the better part of himself. I spent a great many years being the man the stories are about, Captain. I'm not sure it made me a better man. It made me a famous one for a little while in the narrow world that knows such things. And then the war was over, and the men I'd served beside were mostly in the ground, and the famous man was a stranger I didn't much care for. So I put him away. I took a quiet post at a quiet gate, and I learned to stand still, and I found I liked the man who could stand still and let the world laugh better than I'd ever liked the man the stories were about. A pause. I don't shoot to be admired anymore, Holloway. I shoot because I'm good at it, and it's an honest thing to be good at. And I'll not put on the famous man again to teach one proud lord a lesson. The shooting can teach him if it must. I'll keep my mouth shut. The green ribbon, Holloway said quietly. You still wear it. I still wear it, Vale agreed, and his voice changed on the words, went somewhere far away. I'll wear it till they bury me, but I don't talk about it, and I'll thank you not to either. They'll find out tomorrow, Holloway warned. Win or lose, they'll find out who you are. A man can't shoot like that before the whole court and stay a doorkeeper in their eyes. The Queen herself will want to know. It can't stay hidden. Maybe not, said Vale, but I'll not be the one to lift the lid off it. If the truth comes out tomorrow, let it come out on its own legs. Let the shooting answer for itself, the way it always has. That's all I've ever asked of it. I let the tent flap fall, and I lay back in the dark with my heart going hard, because I understood now that I had been even more wrong than I knew. The silent man beside me was not a doorkeeper who happened to shoot well. He was someone the soldiers told stories about, someone famous in the world of fighting men, someone Holloway had recognized on sight and gone quiet with respect. The green ribbon was a piece of that hidden history, the heart of it, a thing he would wear till they buried him and would not speak of. And he had chosen freely, with his eyes open, to set all of that aside and stand at a gate and be laughed at, because he liked the still man better than the famous one. I did not sleep at all after that. I lay awake until the gray came up over the high ground, thinking about what kind of man does such a thing, and knowing that I had met someone the like of whom I would not meet again. And out on the green in the dark, the wind began, very slowly, to die. The fourth day dawned still and golden and perfect, the kind of day a marksman prays for, and I confess my first feeling on stepping from my tent into that clear, calm air was relief. The wind would not betray him after all. On a still day above all days, Corporal Vale could not lose. I had seen what he did to a target on a still day, the ragged single hole, the 5 shots through one. A still day was his day. The wager was as good as won. I was a fool, and the still day was not the gift it seemed, and I should have known it, because the man who had taught me to read the wind had also taught me that the most dangerous moment is the one when you have decided you have already won. Here is what I had not reckoned with, and what Lord Pyrrhal, whatever his faults, had reckoned with very well. A still day is the great equalizer. On a windy day, the rare skill of reading the air separates the master from the merely good, and Vale's mastery had shown plain. But on a still day there is no wind to read. On a still day the contest comes down to the steadiness of the hand, and the keenness of the eye, and the quality of the rifle. And there, on those 3 things alone, the gap between Vale and Pyrrhal narrowed to a hair. For Pyrrhal, on a still day, with his beautiful matched rifle made by the finest gunsmith in the kingdom, could put 5 shots into a cluster you could cover with a wine cup, every single time, without fail. And the plain truth, the hard truth that turned my stomach to water when I understood it that golden morning, was this: Vale's rifle was not his own. I learned it at the armorer's bench, where I went to settle my nerves by fussing over my grandfather's flintlock, and where I found Corporal Vale in low, grim conversation with the contest armorer. His rifle, the long, plain, blued steel target rifle I had watched do impossible things for 3 days, had cracked its stock in the night. Not badly. A hairline down near the wrist of the grip, the kind of flaw that comes of an old weapon hard used and a cold night and ill luck. But a hairline crack in a rifle's stock is death to fine shooting. It lets the barrel shift, ever so slightly, ever so unpredictably, shot to shot, and no hand however steady can correct for a weapon that will not hold true. The armorer had looked at it and shaken his head. It could not be mended before the firing, not properly. Vale could shoot it as it was and pray, or he could borrow another rifle, any of the spare contest pieces on the rack, and shoot a weapon he had never held before in his life, against the finest sportsman in the kingdom, firing the rifle of his bones. I want to stop here and tell you plainly that I do not know whether the crack was ill luck or ill will. I never learned. I have my suspicions. Pyrrhal had a dozen men in his retinue and a great deal of pride at stake, and the tents were not guarded, and a hairline crack is an easy thing to start with a cold chisel and a careful hand in the dark. But I have no proof, and Vale never accused anyone, and a man should not say a thing of another man that he cannot prove. So I will only say, the rifle cracked in the night after the wager was made, and on the one morning when a borrowed rifle would hurt him most. The corporal showed no anger. He turned the cracked rifle over in his hands once slowly, the way you might turn over the body of an old dog, and then he set it down with great gentleness, and he said to the armorer, "Then I'll want to borrow one. The plainest you have, nothing fancy, something honest." The armorer brought him a plain spare, a serviceable contest rifle, well made but undistinguished, the kind of rifle a club keeps for visitors. Vale took it and hefted it and sighted along it at nothing, and his face gave away precisely nothing at all. But I had come to read him a little by then, and I saw the small, careful way he tested the weight and the balance and the pull of the trigger, learning in a few stolen minutes a weapon a man ought to know for years before he trusts his honor to it. And I understood that the wager I had thought as good as one was, on that perfect golden morning, very nearly lost. He would shoot the finest sportsman in Eldermoor, before the Queen and the whole court, with a borrowed rifle he had held for a quarter of an hour, on the one kind of day that gave his great rival every advantage, with his own dignity wagered on the result. And if he lost, when he lost, the cold voice in me whispered, he would strip off his red coat before the crown and the court, and every farmer on that green, and name himself a doorkeeper and a fool, exactly as the great Lord wished, and the silent man I had come to revere would be broken in public for the entertainment of the proud. I found him by his tent, buttoning his red tunic to the throat for the last day. I could not help myself. "Sir," I said, "the wager, you could surely Captain Holloway or the Queen's own people, surely the contest would allow you to withdraw the bet with your rifle ruined through no fault of your own. No one could call it dishonor, no one who saw that crack." He looked at me with those quiet dark eyes, and he finished his top button and he said, "I gave my word, Tobin." "But it isn't fair," I said, and I heard the boy in my own voice, the boy who still believed the world was fair. "He has every advantage, his rifle, the still day, and now yours is, it isn't fair." "No," Corporal Vale agreed. "It isn't." He picked up the borrowed rifle and he settled the bearskin upon his head, and he became once more the immaculate, impossible figure who had stepped onto the green 4 days before. "But fair isn't a thing the world owes you, lad. Fair is a thing you make if you can with what you're given. I've been given a borrowed rifle and a windless day and a man who'd see me shamed." The faint ghost of the not-quite smile touched his mouth. "It's enough. It's been enough with less. Walk down with me if you like." "I'd be glad of the company." And so I walked down the green beside the man everyone had laughed at, toward the gold awning where the Queen of Eldermoor now sat in the morning light with her court around her, to watch him win or lose the last thing he had left to wager. I had never been so near the crown before, and I will tell you that it took my breath. Queen Saralyn sat beneath an awning of cloth of gold at the head of the green, on a raised dais hung with the colors of the House of Harrowgate, and even at a distance, there was something about her that made you understand at once why the people loved her. She was not a hard or a cold figure. She sat forward in her chair, plainly interested, plainly glad to be there, watching the green with a warmth that took in farmer and lord alike. To her one side sat the Prince Consort Aldrich, grave and kind. To her other side, and this is the detail I have never forgotten, sat the two royal children, Prince Joran, perhaps 10 years old, leaning over the rail with his chin in his hands and his whole face alight, and the little Princess Malin, no more than 8, in a dress the color of cornflowers, swinging her feet and clutching a small carved horse and craning to see everything at once. They were children, real children, agog with the excitement of the great contest, and the sight of them there beside the Queen, ordinary in their delight, did more to make the whole proud court seem human than anything else I saw that day. The last 5 marksmen were presented to Her Majesty in turn. When the herald named Lord Castellan-Pearl, the great lord swept off his feathered cap and made a low and graceful bow, and the court murmured its approval, for they knew him. He was one of theirs, the famous champion, and they had come half to see him win his 4th contest. When the herald came to the last name on his list and called, in a voice that plainly did not know what to make of it, Corporal Edrin Vale, of the household foot, a ripple of surprise ran through the dais. I saw the courtiers turn to one another. I saw a lady behind the Queen lift her fan to hide a smile. A common guardsman in his ceremonial dress, among the finest sportsmen of the realm. To the court it was as strange and faintly comical as it had been to the green 4 days before. I heard distinctly a young lord near the dais say to his neighbor, not troubling to lower his voice, "Good heavens, they've let the furniture enter." But the Queen did not laugh. I was watching her, and I saw that she did not laugh. She looked at the silent corporal as he made his bow, a soldier's bow, brief and correct, and something in her warm, clever face went thoughtful, and she leaned the smallest degree toward the Prince Consort and said something to him behind her hand, and he too looked at Vale with new attention. I did not know then what she had seen. I learned later, and I will tell you when I come to it. But even in that first moment, the Queen of Eldermoor looked at the man her court was calling furniture and did not laugh, and I loved her a little for it, and I love her memory still. There was, before the firing began, one more small thing that I did not understand until afterward, and it was Captain Holloway's doing. The old marshal had run the contest for 4 days with his ledger and his brass bell, and not one word more than was needed, scrupulously fair, favoring no man. But when the 5 final marksmen had been presented, and the court had had its murmur and its laugh at the guardsmen among them, Holloway did a thing that was not strictly his to do. He climbed the steps of the dais slowly, for he was old and his knees had carried him through a war, and he bent and spoke a few quiet words into the ear of the Queen, and then he bowed and climbed back down, and he said nothing of it to anyone, and went back to his ledger and his bell. I have wondered all my life what he said. I am nearly sure that he told her who Corporal Vale was, that he could not stand by and let his sovereign watch a hero of the king's long rifles mocked as furniture in her own court without at least one honest soldier seeing to it that she knew the truth. He would not lift the lid off it before the green. Vale had asked him not to, and he was a man who kept faith. But he could tell the Queen, quietly sovereign to old soldier, and let her do with the truth what a queen thought best. And the Queen, you will remember, did not laugh when the corporal made his bow. She looked at him and went thoughtful and leaned to say a word to the Prince Consort. Now I think I know why. The gray old marshal had given her, in a whisper, the eyes to see what her whole court was too proud to see. It is the one part of the tale I cannot prove, for neither of them ever spoke of it. But I knew Holloway a little in the years after before he died, and once, by a fire, when I told him I had always suspected him of it, he only looked into the flames and said, "A man does what he can, lad, with what he's given." I was given a ledger and a bell and one chance to make sure the right person knew the truth. I'd have been a poor soldier to waste it. And he would say no more. But he did not deny it, and from Holloway that was as good as a confession. The final contest was to be 3 strings, fired by each of the 5 marksmen in turn, at a target 200 paces distant, the longest range of the whole Jubilee. 3 strings of 5 shots each, 15 shots in all, and the marksman whose shots lay closest together and nearest the center over all 15 would be named first rifle of the Jubilee. It was the sternest test the green could devise, and on that still and golden morning, with no wind to read, it would come down to nothing but the hand and the eye and the rifle. Pyrrhill, with his Bone's own rifle, smiled as the range was announced. Vale, with his borrowed one, showed nothing at all. They drew lots for the order of firing, and the lot put Pyrrhill first and Vale last, which meant the silent man would have to stand and watch the great lord shoot, and watch the other 3 shoot, and shoot last of all with the whole weight of the contest already laid out plain before him. The hardest place in the order, where a man has the longest time to feel his nerve, and the least room for error when at last his turn comes. Lord Pyrrhill stepped to the line. I will not pretend his first string was anything but magnificent. He took his time, he sighted with that careless practice grace, and he laid 5 shots into a cluster near the very center of the distant target that drew a gasp and then a roar of applause from the court. 200 paces, and he had shot as though it were 50. He turned and bowed to the queen, and the gold awning rang with the approval of his own kind, and the famous champion's golden confidence blazed up brighter than ever. His second string was as fine as his first. His third string wavered the smallest degree. Even Pyrrhill was human. Even Pyrrhill felt the weight of the crown's eye, but it was still a magnificent piece of shooting. And when his 15 shots were totted up and the marker walked the long way back from the target with the count, the number was very near to perfect. The court rose to its feet. Lord Castellan Pyrrhill, the finest sportsman in Eldermoor, had shot the contest of his life before his queen, and he knew it, and he turned at last to where the silent corporal stood waiting at the rear of the line, and across the whole green he gave the man he had mocked for 4 days a slow and golden and triumphant smile. "Beat that," the smile said. "Beat that, doorkeeper, with your borrowed gun if you can, and when you cannot, take off your pretty coat." The 3 middle marksmen shot and shot well and could not come near Pyrrhill's number, and one by one they bowed and stood aside, and the court grew quiet, because now there was only the last man left to shoot, the strange one, the guardsman, the furniture, and a contest that everyone on that dais believed was already decided. The herald called the last string of the Queen's Jubilee. And Corporal Edrin Vale, in his red wool tunic and his tall black bearskin and his white gloves, with a borrowed rifle in his hands and the faded green ribbon on his breast, and the whole proud court waiting to laugh, stepped to the line. I want you to feel for a moment what I felt as he walked to that line, because the court did not feel it and the cheering crowd did not feel it, and only a handful of us on the whole green knew the truth of what we were watching. We knew the rifle in his hands was borrowed, held for a quarter of an hour. We knew his own had cracked in the night, whether by ill luck or ill will. We knew the day was windless, and that a windless day was the one day that gave the great lord every advantage and took from the corporal his rarest gift. We knew Pyrrhill had just shot the contest of his life, a number very near to perfect, and that to beat it a man would have to shoot not merely well but flawlessly, with a strange weapon, at the longest range of the Jubilee, with his own dignity wagered on the result and the whole court waiting to laugh. And we knew, Bramwell knew it, standing beside me with his great hands knotted white at the cord. I knew it. Holloway knew it, gripping his ledger. The soft-faced boy Wenlin, who had stopped laughing days ago, knew that it could not be done. That no man alive could do it. That we were about to watch the finest shooting any of us would ever see, and watch it fall just short, and watch a good man strip off his coat before the crown for the sport of the proud. I could not breathe. Bramwell, beside me, had stopped breathing too. I heard him start again with a ragged catch. Down the cord, a woman had her hand pressed to her mouth. I did not pray often in those days, but I prayed then, the wordless, desperate prayer of a young man for a man he has come to love, and I do not think I was the only one on that green sending up the same. And in the middle of all our terror, the man himself was calm. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He set the butt of the borrowed rifle to the ground, and he stood a moment, perfectly still, in the way I had come to know, the way of a man making the whole world fall away until nothing was left but himself, the rifle, and the distant target shimmering 200 paces down the green. And I understood, watching him, that all our terror was nothing to him. It could not reach him. He stood at the line as he had stood at the gate, as he had stood, I now knew, in the worst country in the worst time the realm had ever seen, with the lives of men he loved riding on a single shot from a half-mile off. And against that, against the things this man had carried his whole life, what was a country contest and a borrowed gun and a court's laughter? Nothing. Less than nothing. He had been here before in the only way that mattered, 100 times, in places where a miss meant something far worse than the loss of a wager. And he had not missed. He stood in our terror like a rock standing in surf, and our terror broke over him and could not move him an inch. And slowly, watching that impossible calm, I felt my own terror begin to ebb, and in its place came something I can only call faith. The court watched him stand there motionless, and I heard the first titters begin among the courtiers, the same titters the green had given on the first day, the cruel, easy amusement of people who see only the costume. The young lord near the dais said something behind his hand, and his neighbor smiled. Then Corporal Vale raised the borrowed rifle to his shoulder, and the titters died. I cannot fully explain what changed in the air of that green when he lifted the rifle, and I have tried to explain it for 50 years. It was the same thing I had felt on the first day, the focusing of a wide light to a single burning point. But here, before the crown with everything wagered on it, it was 100 times stronger, and it reached even the courtiers who had never seen him shoot. The whole vast crowd, the farmers and the foresters and the lords and the ladies and the queen herself, fell silent. Not the silence of mockery now, but the silence of a held breath. The silence of 2,000 people who have all at once understood, without quite knowing how, that they are about to see something they have never seen. He fired. Crack a breath. He did not lower the rifle. Crack a breath. The rhythm I knew, the slow, terrible patience, each shot following the last like the toll of a deep bell, but faster now, surer, the borrowed rifle no longer borrowed but become in his hands an extension of his will as wholly as his own had been. Crack, a breath, crack. He had taken the measure of the strange weapon in his first shot and bent it utterly to his purpose by his second, and from the third shot on he was no longer learning the rifle but simply using it, the way a master uses any tool that comes to his hand. Crack, the fifth shot. He held the rifle a moment longer, listening to whatever it was he listened to, and then he set the butt to the ground and stood as he had stood before, eyes forward, white-gloved and immaculate, waiting. The marker walked the long 200 paces to the target. The marker stopped. The marker stood very still, looking at the target for a long, long moment. And then he did not turn and call for Holloway. He turned and looked up the green, the whole length of it, at the gold awning and the queen, and he lifted the target itself off its frame and held it up over his head with both hands so that the whole court could see it. And across the silent green, there came from that marker a single cracked shout of pure disbelief. One hole. A roar went up such as I have never heard before or since. For there, on the distant target held aloft in the marker's 2 hands, where Lord Pearl's magnificent 15 shots had made a cluster the size of an apple near the center. Corporal Vale's 15 shots. 15, mind you, at 200 paces, with a rifle he had held for a quarter of an hour, on the longest range of the Jubilee, had gone very nearly through a single ragged hole, dead in the heart of the target, a hole you could have covered with a child's fist. It was not better than Pearl's shooting. It was not the same thing as Pearl's shooting at all. It was as far beyond it as Pearl's was beyond mine, and it had been done under every disadvantage the world and the great Lord could heap upon one man, and the court of Eldermoor came to its feet as one and roared. I looked at Lord Castellan Pearl, and I will remember his face until I die. The golden confidence was simply gone, scoured clean off, and beneath it was the face of a man who has just understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what he has spent 4 days laughing at. He stood there white and stricken while the court that had come to cheer his fourth victory roared instead for the doorkeeper, and he made no move at all, because there was no move to make. But the contest, you see, was not the end of it. The contest was only the door. What came through that door in the next few minutes was the thing I had walked 4 days and lain awake 2 nights to see, though I did not know it was coming, and neither did the green, and neither, I think, did the proud court on the dais. It was the Queen who opened it. When the roar had at last begun to die, Queen Saralind rose from her chair beneath the gold awning, and the green fell silent again, for when the Queen rises a kingdom holds its breath. She looked down the long green at the silent corporal standing immaculate at the line, and she did not call for a herald, and she did not send a courtier. She came down from the dais herself, with the prince consort a step behind her and the 2 royal children scrambling after, and she walked the length of the green to the firing line, to the man her own court had called furniture not a quarter of an hour before, and she stopped before him, and she looked at the faded green ribbon on his breast. "Corporal Vale," she said, and her clear voice carried the length of the silent green, "I have been trying since the herald named you to remember where I had heard that name. I have it now." She looked from the ribbon to his face. "You were not always a corporal of the household foot, were you?" It was not a question. Corporal Vale was silent a moment, and I saw the old war in him, the man who would not be the one to lift the lid off his own history, set against the plain fact that his queen had asked, and that a soldier answers his sovereign true. "No, your majesty," he said quietly, "I was not always." "The green ribbon," the queen said. "I have seen one other like it in my life. My father wore it, the old king, your king once, and he wore it to his grave, and he told me what it was, and he told me there were never many men alive at one time who had earned the right to it." She paused, and the green hung on her words. "It is the ribbon of the king's long rifles." A sound went through the court, a low sound, the sound of a great many people who half know a name and are reaching for the rest of it. I will tell you what I learned, that day and after, of the king's long rifles, because the court of Eldermoor knew it and the green did not, and you must know it to understand the silence that fell. In the old king's wars, a generation gone, when the realm had stood in its greatest peril and the issue had hung by a thread, there had been a single small regiment upon which, more than once, the saving of the kingdom had turned. They were marksmen, the finest the realm had ever found, gathered from every corner of it, foresters and gamekeepers and poachers and farmers' sons, who could do with a rifle what other men could not dream of. And they were sent where no army could go, in 2s and 3s and alone, to do the quiet and terrible and decisive work that turns a war without ever filling a field with the dead. They asked for no glory and were given none, for their work was secret by its nature. The songs were sung of the great cavalry charges and the famous generals, and the men of the long rifles went unsung by design. But the soldiers knew. The men who had been saved by a single impossible shot from a ridge a half-mile off, when all seemed lost, they knew, and they told the stories low among themselves for the rest of their lives. And the king, the old king, knew best of all, and he made for the men of that regiment a single decoration, a plain green ribbon, the color of the high country where the best of them had been bred, and he gave it with his own hand to the few who earned it, and he told them what he told no one else, that the realm owed its life to men whose names it would never know, and that this ribbon was the realm's whole thanks, given in private because the truth could not be told in public. There were never many. By the time of the Queen's Jubilee there were, the heralds reckoned afterward, perhaps a half-dozen men still living who wore the green ribbon of the king's long rifles honestly. And one of them had stood at a gate for years and let tourists make faces at him, and had walked onto the great green at Harrogate in his ceremonial dress, and had been laughed at for 4 days by the finest sportsmen in Eldermoor as a doorkeeper and a statue, and a man fit only to stand still and be mocked. The court understood it all at once. I watched the understanding sweep across the gold awning and down through the assembled lords and ladies like wind across a field of grain, and I watched the faces change, the amusement, the condescension, the easy contempt of people who had seen only a costume, all of it draining away and leaving behind it something I had not expected to see on those proud faces. Shame. The young lord who had called him furniture had gone the color of ash. For they understood, every one of them, that they had spent the morning laughing at a man to whom, very possibly, some of them owed the lives of their fathers, a man who had done, in secret and unthanked, the work that had kept the kingdom they so casually adorned from falling into the dark. Queen Saralyn turned slowly and looked down the green at Lord Castellan Pearl. She did not have to say a word, the look was enough. The whole court was looking at him now, and the whole green, and the great golden lord who had wagered to strip this man of his dignity before the crown stood exposed in the full and terrible light of what he had done, not the loser of a shooting match, which he could have borne, but the man who had mocked a hero of the realm to his face for 4 days and tried to break him for sport. There is no medal a man can win that will armor him against that. Pearl's famous golden face crumpled, and he looked, for the first time in his charmed and easy life, like a man who wished the ground would open and take him. But it was Corporal Vale who broke the silence, and what he said is the part of the whole tale I have carried closest to my heart for 50 years. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, with respect, "I'd ask that not be made of it." The Queen looked at him. "Corporal." "The ribbon," Vale said, "what it is. The men who earned it in the quiet, and most of them are in the ground now, and they'd not have wanted a fuss made over the few of us left. We did our work and we came home, those of us who came home, and we asked for nothing, and I'd not start asking now." He stood there, immaculate and unbreakable, and he said the thing that I think was the whole truth of him. "I didn't come here to be known, Your Majesty. I came here to shoot. The shooting's done now, and it answered for itself, the way it always does. I'd be content to go back to my gate if it please you, and trouble no one further." For a long moment the Queen of Eldermoor looked at the man who had just asked, at the summit of his triumph, to be allowed to disappear back into a quiet life of standing still. And then she did a thing I have never forgotten, a thing that told me why her people loved her. She smiled, not the cool smile of a sovereign granting a favor, but the warm and human smile of one person who has recognized another. "You ask me to make nothing of it," she said. "I will respect the men who earned that ribbon, Corporal, and I will not parade what they kept quiet. You have my word on that, and my word is as good as yours." A murmur of relief, oddly, from some of the older courtiers, men who I think understood. But I will not pretend I did not see what this green saw today. And there is one matter I cannot leave as it lies, because it was done in public, and what is done in public must be answered in public, or honor means nothing. She turned again toward Lord Pearl, and her warmth went out of her voice and left it level and cold and clear. "My lord, I am told there was a wager." Pearl could not speak. He managed barely to bow his head. "I am told," the Queen went on, "that you wagered, should you lose, to keep silent for 1 day. To stand quiet at the line and learn what it is to hold your tongue, to taste a single day of the very discipline you mocked in this man for 4. She let it hang. I am also told the corporal asked nothing else of you. No gold, no groveling, no coat stripped off before the court, though that was the price you set for him. He asked only that you be still and silent for one day. The queen looked at the great golden lord, and her clear, cold voice carried to the farthest edge of the green. It seems to me a merciful wager, my lord, and a wise one, and a more fitting lesson than any I could devise. So you will honor it. From this hour until this hour tomorrow you will speak no word, here on this green, before this court and these good people of the realm. You will stand and you will watch, and you will be silent. And perhaps in that day of silence you will learn what this man learned at a gate that you, with all your gold and all your medals, had never troubled to learn at all, that there is more strength in a man who holds his tongue than in a man who cannot. She paused. Do you accept the judgment of your wager, Lord Pyrrhal? And the finest sportsman in Eldermoor, white and humbled before the whole realm, opened his mouth, and then closed it again, for he had just been commanded to silence, and he bowed his head and said nothing at all, and his silence was his answer, and it was the most eloquent thing the proud man had ever done. A low sound went through the green then, not a roar this time. Something gentler and somehow larger, the sound of a great many people watching justice done plainly and well, without cruelty and without excess, exactly to the measure of the wrong. The doorkeeper had not been the one to humble the Lord. The Lord had humbled himself with his own wager, and the queen had only held him to it. And in the holding there was a kind of grace, for she had given him a day of silence rather than a lifetime of shame, and a man who used the day well might come out of it better than he went in. I do not know whether Lord Castellan Pyrrhal ever became a better man, but I know he kept the day of silence, every hour of it, and I know that when it was over he walked the length of the green to where Corporal Vale stood and offered him his hand without a word, and that the corporal took it, and that was the end of it between them. But I have run ahead of myself, for there was one thing more that golden morning, before the green broke up and the Jubilee passed into history. The little Princess Malin, who had scrambled down from the dais after her mother and stood the whole while clutching her carved horse and watching everything with enormous solemn eyes, tugged at the queen's sleeve, and the queen bent to hear her, and then the queen laughed softly and straightened. My daughter, she said to Corporal Vale, has a question for the first rifle of the Jubilee, and she will not be at peace until it is answered. I told her she might ask it herself. And the little princess looked up at the immaculate guardsman, the hero of the king's long rifles, the man the whole court had laughed at, and she asked, in the clear, unfrightened voice of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of anyone, "How did you not mind them laughing at you?" The green went quiet to hear his answer. Corporal Vale looked down at the small girl in the cornflower dress, and the stern, still face I had watched for 4 days did a thing I had not once seen it do. It softened. The statue softened, all the way through, the way I had heard the household men did only for the children of the house, and he went down on one knee on the green grass before the little princess, so that his eyes were level with hers, and he spoke to her gently, and because the green was silent we all heard it. I did mind a little, he said. I'll not tell you I didn't, for that would be a lie, and you ought never to be told lies. It stings to be laughed at. It stings everyone. The princess nodded gravely, as though this confirmed something she had long suspected. But I learned a thing once when I was young in a hard place, Vale went on. I learned that when a man laughs at you, he is telling you about himself, not about you. He is telling you what he thinks is funny, and what he thinks is funny is a thing he does not understand. And you cannot be hurt for long by a man who does not understand you, only by one who does. He paused. So when they laughed I thought, there is a man who does not understand, and I felt no anger at him, only a little sorrow that he should go through the world understanding so little. And then I looked at my targets, and I let the laughing go because the targets were the truth of it, and the laughing was only noise. The faint ghost of his not quite smile touched his mouth. The truth doesn't laugh, Little Highness. The truth just waits. and in the end the truth always speaks last. The little princess considered this with the whole of her small, grave being, and then she nodded once, decisively, as though she had filed it away forever, and she held out her carved wooden horse to him. "You can hold him," she said. "He helps when things are hard." And Corporal Edrin Vale, hero of the king's long rifles, first rifle of the Jubilee, the man the realm owed more than it would ever know, took the little wooden horse in his white-gloved hand as gravely and as gently as if it had been the crown itself, and held it a moment and gave it back. "Thank you," he said. "He's a fine horse. He helped." I have told this tale a great many times in the 50 years since, by a great many fires, to a great many people who were not there, and I have watched them lean in at the shooting and gasp at the reveal and go quiet at the green ribbon. But it is that, the man on his knee in the grass and the wooden horse and the truth that waits and speaks last, it is that I always come back to, that I will carry to my own grave, because it was there, and not at the firing line, that I finally understood what I had been watching all along. The Queen offered him the commission that was the first rifle's prize, any posting of honor in the whole of the Crown's service, his to choose. The court waited to hear which great place he would name. He asked to go back to his gate. The Queen smiled and granted it, and added only this, that from that day the gate Corporal Vale stood would be known among the household as a post of honor, and that the men who stood it after him would be told whose post it had been, so that the realm might keep, in that one quiet way, the memory of a man who had never asked to be remembered. And I am told that to this day, at a certain quiet gate of Harrowgate Palace, the guardsmen who stand it stand a little straighter than at any other, and that when a tourist laughs and pulls a face at the motionless man in red, the older guards only smile, because they know what the laughing man does not, that the truth does not laugh. The truth just waits. There is more I could tell you of what became of them all, and since you have come this far with me, I will tell you a little, for the threads of that Jubilee ran on through many lives, mine among them. Bramwell the forester, the great bear of a man who first taught me to see what I was looking at, did not win the contest either. He placed honorably among the last 5 and went home to his high woods with his head up, and he told the tale of the silent corporal at every hearth in the North Country until he died, full of years, and I am told there are foresters in those hills who tell it yet, having had it from men who had it from him. So that the corporal's 5 balls through one hole have passed into the legends of a country he never set foot in. That is how the truth travels in the end, not through heralds and proclamations, through honest men telling honest men what they saw with their own eyes. The soft-faced boy, Wenlin, the one who had stopped laughing on the first day and gone pale at the green ribbon on the last, he is the one of Pirrell's circle I am gladdest to tell of, for he was young, and the young can change, and he did. He came to find me, years afterward, when he had grown into a sober and a decent man, at a fair where I was selling the produce of my little farm, having recognized my face from the green. He told me that the Jubilee had been the making of him, that watching a man he had been taught to despise turn out to be the finest soul on that field had cracked something open in him, and shown him what his own circle truly was, and that he had quietly left it not long after and made a different life. "I have spent 20 years," he said, "trying to be more like the man we laughed at and less like the man we cheered. I don't always manage it. But I try, and I'd not be trying at all if not for that green." He asked me whether the corporal yet lived, and I told him what I knew, and he went away thoughtful, and I never saw him again, but I have always been glad of him. One man, out of all the laughing, who let the truth change him, that is not nothing, that may be everything. Of Lord Castellan Pirrell I know less, and what I know I have told you. He kept his day of silence to the hour. He offered his hand. Whether the day of silence the Queen gave him in mercy did the work she hoped it would, whether he went home a humbler man or only a more careful one, I cannot say. Great lords do not report their hearts to farmers, and our paths never crossed again. But I will say this in fairness, having said much against him, he could have refused the wager's judgment. He had the power and the pride to make a great ugly scene of it, to storm off the green crying foul, to spend his considerable influence blackening the corporal's name in every drawing room in the realm. He did none of it. He stood his day of silence before the people he had ruled with his charm for years, and he took his medicine, and at the end he crossed the green and offered his hand to a man who had every right to refuse it. That took a kind of courage too, a smaller and a later courage than the corporal's, but real. I have come to believe that the best thing that ever happened to Lord Pirrell was losing to a doorkeeper, and I hope, for the sake of his soul, that some part of him came to believe it too. As for me, I never won a thing at the Queen's Jubilee. I went home to my river country with my grandfather's flintlock and not a coin to show for the 4 days. But I went home having learned, from a man who never once raised his voice to teach it, the lesson that has shaped the whole of my long life, that the quietest man at the table is very often the strongest, that a man who must tell you what he is has already lost the better part of it, and that real mastery, true mastery, the kind worth having, never needs to announce itself, because, in the end, the shooting answers for itself. I took up my grandfather's trade in the years that followed, and a little of his other trade too, and I never grew rich, and I never grew famous, and there were long stretches when I thought my one brush with greatness had been those 4 days on a green when I was 22, and a man I barely knew showed me what a man could be. But I have come to think that is wrong. I think the corporal gave me more than a story to tell by the fire. I think he gave me a way to carry my own small life. For I have been mocked in my time as all men are. I have been underestimated and overlooked and laughed at by men with finer coats and emptier hearts. And every time, every single time, I have heard his low, even voice in my memory saying, "When a man laughs at you, he is telling you about himself, not about you, and the truth doesn't laugh. The truth just waits." And I have looked at my targets, whatever my targets were in that hour, a field to plow, a child to raise, a wrong to set right, and I have let the laughing go, and I have done my honest work, and the work has answered for itself, the way it always does, the way he promised the little princess it would. I do not know whether Corporal Edrin Vale still lives. He would be very old now, older than I am, and that is old indeed. But I like to think that somewhere, at a certain quiet gate of Harrowgate Palace, the post they named for him still stands, and the young guardsmen who hold it stand a little straighter for the name, and that when a stranger laughs and pulls a face at the motionless man in red, the older guards only smile and say nothing, because they know what the laughing man does not. They know what the green ribbon means. They know that the man who does not move and does not speak is very often the most dangerous man on the field. And they know the oldest truth of the long range, the one the corporal taught a whole proud court in a single windless morning 50 years ago, and taught a frightened boy of 22 for the rest of his life. The truth does not laugh. The truth just waits. And in the end, in the long, patient, unhurried end, the truth always speaks last. It always does. It always has. And it always will, for as long as there are quiet men who would rather let their work speak than their mouths, and young men like the one I was, lucky enough to stand beside them once and learn to listen.